In the winter of 1897, a section of barn collapsed beneath wet snow on the outskirts of Flint Hollow, Missouri. What it revealed beneath the soil defied both carpentry and scripture, an inverted chapel with pews bolted to the ceiling, dry as bone, untouched by time. Local records offered no mention of its construction, but decades earlier, the town's children had stopped fidgeting. They sat straighter, spoke less, and when asked about their lessons, they repeated a single phrase: "My spine is a path, and it must stay straight." No one remembers who taught them that, but something in the soil does. Like the video and subscribe if you're ready to step into the macabre history of the Delaney Folds. And if you're listening right now, tell me your country and the time. There's comfort in knowing we're all out there scattered across timelines, watching the same story unfold. In the autumn of 1839, the dirt road leading into Flint Hollow wore no grooves deep enough to betray the future, just a single track of flattened weeds and splintered cedar roots, the kind of path that suggested people left more often than they arrived. There were only 32 families in Flint Hollow then, spread thin across the hills above the Riverbend Mission District. The soil was poor, the sermons were long, and the children, some said, had grown strange. That October, as the last of the corn dried on the stalks and mist hung low in the mornings, a letter arrived by saddle post to the Church of Union Temperance headquarters in Jackson County. The ink had run at the corners, as if the parchment had been held too tightly or prayed over too long. It was signed in shaky script by Pastor Elijah Rima, the aging preacher of Flint Hollow's Mission Chapel. "They do not sit still, they shudder when stillness is required. Some bend at odd hours, and others sing out of step. I have disciplined the children. The whip does not work. I fear what lives in their spines is not of our teaching." The church responded within the week. Their reply was bureaucratic, almost cheerful in its phrasing. A single sheet of pressed cream paper stamped with the seal of the Union Temperance Ministry. "The Delaney family shall be dispatched post-haste with the blessing of moral alignment and structural correction. Upright in doctrine, proven strict in method, recommended thrice over by our brethren in Warren Township." The Delaneys had no formal rank in the church hierarchy, yet their name appeared in more than a dozen mission records across 3 states, always following reports of behavioral irregularity, always marked with phrases like "folded youth," "inert tongues," or "inattentive knees." No photograph of the family exists. Only a sketched likeness in the margin of a minister's logbook shows a burnt-abam man with long arms and a neck that appears unnaturally still. When their wagon arrived at the edge of Flint Hollow 2 weeks later, it was just past dawn. Witness accounts conflict. Some say there were 4 riders, others 5, but most agree on one thing: the crates. 3 tall trunks were strapped tightly to the back of the cart, bound with iron loops and stamped in black lettering: "Correctional." It was the only word marked on any of their possessions. No scripture, no labels, no names. The wagon didn't stop in town. It went straight to the edge of the woods where the schoolhouse met the chapel grounds, on a sloped acre of land that had once been reserved for spring baptisms. Within 3 days, the Delaneys had converted the baptismal site into a barn-like structure with a rear room locked from the outside. The blacksmith who assisted them, a man named Petrus Vale, left a short journal entry now preserved in the Riverbend District Archives. Asked what the crates held, one of the sons said, "Frames for the crooked, oil for the willing, and ropes to hold what trembles." I told him I only meant it friendly. He didn't answer, just nodded toward the planks and asked for 6-inch nails. Vale's journal ends 2 pages later with a curious entry dated October 29th. "Don't remember what we built. My back hurts. Every time I sit straight, I feel watched." The family itself was rarely seen all together. Father Delaney, never named in official records, was said to wear a coat even in heat and carried a walking stick he never leaned on. The 3 sons, in their 20s, were indistinguishable to many, thin, polite, and eerily synchronized. The daughter, known only as Miss Delaney, was described in one neighbor's letter as neat as a lantern post, never tilted, never winded. Children in town whispered that she never blinked when the school bell rang. Pastor Rima's private writings, sealed after his death in 1847 and unsealed decades later, contain only one description of her. The girl prays without moving her lips. Her hands never rest on her knees. She reads the Psalms like measurements. And when she enters the room, the babies turn their heads away, as if knowing what's to come. By November, the Delaneys were hosting quiet hours 3 times a week in the barn behind their home. Parents were invited to observe, though most declined. Those who attended later recalled the smell of heated oil and the creak of wood stretching against metal pins. A surviving page from a community newsletter, hand-copied in pencil, described the sessions like this. Children sat in frames, not tied, but enclosed. Upright posture reinforced by straps across the clavicle and lower back. One child began to shake, was removed and returned 2 days later, calm, posture perfect, no tears, no voice. One visitor claimed to hear low singing during a session, though none of the children's mouths were moving, and then the town simply adjusted. By winter, the word alignment had entered local speech, not as punishment, but as aspiration. A school notice from January 1840 reads, "All students who remain in alignment through morning lessons may receive warm cider." No one recalls who wrote it. When asked years later why they allowed it, why they let the Delaneys reshape their children's routines, most surviving families gave similar answers. They sat straighter, they read faster, they listened better. No one seemed to recall unloading the crates. In 1882, long after the family had vanished and the barn collapsed under heavy snow, a county official sorting early mission correspondences found the original letter from Pastor Rima. On the back, in red chalk, a different hand had written 3 words, uncertain in grammar, but firm in conviction, T. He bent to echo. No source has been verified for the handwriting. No reply from the Church of Union Temperance to that message exists in the archive. But beside the letter, tucked between crumbling folders and moth-bit hymnals, was a folded scrap of linen, soft, worn, and stained with linseed oil. Etched into the fabric, stitched so tight the thread had split the weave, was a diagram of the human spine, and beneath it one final phrase, "Faith is straight." By the turn of 1841, the frost clung to the hills of Flint Hollow like a second skin. Smoke rose thin and slow from chimney flues. The corn husks were long gathered, the river iced just enough to silence its chatter. And the children, once known for their barefoot runs and breathless laughter, no longer played near the chapel at dusk. Something had settled over the town. Not a curse, not a fever. Just an unnatural stillness that touched every porch, every field, every child's voice. The kind of silence that doesn't arrive all at once, but creeps in week by week, until no one remembers the last time someone interrupted a sermon with a sneeze. School records from the winter term of 1841 show a remarkable improvement in attendance. Of the 32 enrolled students, only 2 missed more than a single day in December. Illness had declined, so had misbehavior, but so had something else. They come in quiet, sit straight before I even ask, recite their lessons without glance or gesture. It's tidy, but it's not childhood, wrote teacher Ruth Marlowe in her weekly journal. No one giggles when ink spills, no one slouches when bored. I miss the nonsense. Ruth had taught in Flint Hollow since 1835. Her letters to her sister in Springfield are preserved in a private family archive and offer a personal lens into the shift. They've stopped asking questions, Bet. They speak only when called on, and always in full sentences, as if reading from something rehearsed. A few even rise in unison now, without looking at each other. I find myself blinking too much just to feel human. By January, the change had reached the pulpit. Sunday sermons at Riverbend Chapel, once interrupted by restless boys and coughs from the back pews, now unfolded in silence so complete it felt like a debt. Pastor Rima, still recovering from illness, took to shortening his homilies, unnerved by the stare is of children who didn't look at him, but through him. They do not blink when I speak. Their backs do not bend in prayer. Even the babies are still when brought to the aisle. Pastor Elijah Rima, Marginalia, Riverbend, Homily Book 2. When pressed by visiting clergy, Rima described the Delaney's alignment routines as a sort of moral hygiene, a system of structured behavior correction conducted outside the official school or church curriculum. Participation was technically voluntary, but by February, every child in town, except one, had joined. The routines, as described in fragments and whispers, took place in the long room behind the Delaney barn. Children were brought in small groups and instructed to sit upright on straight-backed benches lined against the walls. They were given small wooden dowels to rest along their spines. If the dowel shifted, they were instructed to begin the posture exercise again. The room was lit by oil lamps that never flickered, even in wind. Hymns were sung, but only in a single note, droned repeatedly until the tone felt less like melody and more like pressure. Each child recited a phrase aloud before beginning. "My spine is a path, and it must stay straight." This phrase appears in at least 9 journal entries and 2 unsigned notices sent to the schoolhouse. In every instance, it is repeated exactly, never altered, never abbreviated. One journal, attributed to 12-year-old Naomi Wendell, contains an unsettling passage from February the 16th. "He touched my shoulders and said, 'I leaned like someone with secrets. So I closed my mouth and held still until I felt the secret leave.'" The journal was discovered years later in a disused root cellar on the Wendell property. It had been hidden inside a box of rusted school books. Most pages are torn. One bears a crude drawing of a human figure, its spine marked with 33 ticks, each numbered, each a nota, Ted with the word silent. Not all parents were uneasy. In fact, most praised the improvements. At the March 1841 town meeting, minutes record Mr. Alton Brewer, a mill hand and father of 5, as saying, "We asked for order, we asked for discipline. The Delaneys delivered what even scripture failed to shape. Our children are no longer unruly, they're reverent." Others agreed. That spring, corporal punishment dropped in both school and home. Children went to bed on time, no fights were reported. It was, to many, a kind of moral miracle. But a few noticed the cost. "They're not learning to be good," whispered Agnes Wilkes, a local herbalist. "They're learning to disappear." Agnes's own niece, 7-year-old Clara, stopped speaking altogether after her 6th alignment session. She remained healthy, ate well, did chores, slept soundly, but she never again laughed, never again played near the creek. By summer, she responded only when addressed by her full name. In a rare surviving record, one of the Delaney sons, presumed to be Arlen, wrote a brief note in response to an inquiry about the alignment sessions. The note, held in the private collection of a former Union temperance archivist, reads, "The crooked world cannot teach the child how to stand. It must be taught by stillness. The still child is a vessel. The restless one is a wound." It is the only known document bearing a Delaney signature, though the name itself is printed, not written. The signature is unnaturally small, as if forced beneath the weight of the text above it. By April, even the livestock grew uneasy. Farmers reported that calves refused to graze near the Delaney barn. Dogs barked at its walls but wouldn't approach the door. One farmer, Jonas Reed, swore he saw a flicker inside the barn one night, a long row of children standing without motion as a figure walked behind them, holding something long and black. Could have been a cane, would have been a stick, but he didn't limp, and it never touched the ground. Reed later refused to attend further meetings. His own son, 14, left Flint Hollow in July and never returned. And then there was the silence. By midsummer, townsfolk remarked that the schoolyard had gone soundless during recess. Children stirred in loose groups, unmoving, their eyes trained on a distant point no adult could see. When prompted, they returned to class wordlessly. A school ledger from June contains a rare disciplinary note from teacher Marlowe. Elias Truggle stared at the corner for 7 full minutes. I asked him what he was looking at. He said, "The place where crooked ends." I told him to sit. He sat, but he never blinked. The following week, Elias was removed from school. No reason was given. The only known surviving child to resist the alignment sessions was Martha Harkel, daughter of a local sawyer. Her mother forbade participation, calling the Delaneys oil preachers and body puppeteers. Martha walked with a noticeable lean in her left shoulder, likely from a childhood injury, but remained lively, sharp-witted, and fond of rhyming games. In August of 1841, she began to complain of stiffness in her back. By September, she could no longer raise her arms above her head. She died 3 years later, cause of death, degenerative bone fusion, her attending coroner, Arlen Delaney. Today, no one lives full-time in Flint Hollow. The remaining foundation stones of the old schoolhouse rest in overgrown moss. The Delaney barn, long since collapsed, has been reclaimed by thistle and vine. But the Riverbend church bell still hangs. It has not rung in over a century. Inside the chapel, etched faintly into the back of a wooden pew, is the phrase once spoken by children in unison, "My spine is a path, and it must stay straight." No one remembers carving it, and the grain of the wood he may wells each spring, but the words do not fade. In the spring of 1843, the last frost came early. The soil cracked with the first thaw, and the river, long choked with ice, ran fast and swollen past the edge of Flint Hollow. Crops were planted ahead of schedule. A new roof went up on the chapel, and down near the bend, where the hillside flattened into lowland pasture, the Delaney family completed renovations on their barn. What had once been a modest feed house used for storing grain and drying leather was now, by all local accounts, something else entirely. The sign over the barn's double door had been removed. In its place, 2 metal brackets curved upward into the shape of a twisted wishbone. The townspeople didn't call it a barn anymore. They called it the room. It had no formal title in ledgers or maps, but everyone knew what happened there. They called it correction, they called it alignment, and for the children of Flint Hollow, it would become the place where posture was treated as prayer and movement as sin. It was a mother, Clara Small, who first referred to the interior as the harness room. She used the phrase casually during a church gathering, almost affectionately. "They sit so nice now, after their sessions in the harness room. No wiggling, no nonsense. Like little gentlemen, even the girls." Her words were echoed by others, not with pride, but with the relief of order. Because in a town where crops failed often and the cold killed early, quiet children were considered a kind of grace. Inside the barn, the transformation was complete by April. The hayloft had been removed, the rafters darkened with pitch, walls were stripped bare and replaced with vertical planks lined in narrow slots, braces for holding dowels or rods. A series of 6 benches were positioned against the walls at exact intervals, each one facing inward toward a center circle marked with charcoal rings. The marks have long since faded, but early descriptions of the space survive in the private notebooks of Dr. Jonas Meek, the only physician in Flint Hollow at the time. His journal entry from May 6, 1843, now archived in the Missouri Historical Care Records, reads, "Visited the Delaney structure today on invitation. Interior cold, despite the heat. Children placed in vertical seated positions, each restrained across lower torso and clavicle by padded wooden arms. Hands rested on knees, eyes forward. They were not in pain, but showed no variation in posture. Spines extended unnaturally straight, as if pulled upward by something unseen. All motion ceased once inside." Dr. Meek noted 6 children that day, 4 boys and 2 girls, all of whom bore bruising along the outer arms and lower back. The markings were uniform, circular, perfectly mirrored from left to right. "Not accidental," he wrote. "No child falls symmetrically." Despite this, Dr. Meek filed no complaint, no medical alert. He returned home and made no follow-up visit. In later interviews, conducted decades after his death by his surviving son, there is mention of a sealed letter, never sent, addressed to the Missouri Temperance Oversight Council. It was found in a locked drawer of his writing desk and reads, "I fear they're testing the nervous system itself, flattening it like wheat. The children obey because their joints no longer remember resistance." The letter was dated July 1843. It ends with a single postscript. Their eyes moved too slowly, as if calculating permission. The Delaneys were never questioned. No inquiry was made. What emerged instead was a quiet integration of the barn sessions into local parenting philosophy. Children who once played in the dust behind the schoolhouse now sat silently during recess, their backs pressed against fence posts to keep shape. Local mothers began carrying yardsticks, not for discipline, but for alignment checks. A boy who slouched during a sermon was asked not if he was tired, but if his ladder was failing. A new phrase entered the town's vocabulary. "He's begun to tilt." Inside the barn, instruction followed a ritualized structure. The children sat in their restraints for precisely 40 minutes. No speaking, no shifting, just the low tick of an oil-dipped stick tapping the floor at steady intervals, held by one of the Delaney sons. The sound echoed like a second heartbeat in the planked chamber. Surviving children, now elderly, most unwilling to speak, have recalled only fragments. One, who gave his testimony under condition of anonymity in 1911, remembered the timing rope, a length of braided cord hung from the rafters, knotted every 12 inches. When it was lowered across the children's backs, they were expected to line their spines beneath the knots. If the rope slid down, he said, you started over. If it slid twice, they brought the oil. The oil, referenced in multiple journals and oral histories, was a key part of the process. A linseed solution, warmed in small copper kettles, was applied to the back of the neck and along the spine. The child was instructed to feel the stillness enter. Sometimes, a hymn was whispered during this application, not sung, just a faint repetition of a single line spoken in unison by the Delaneys. Straight is the path, the crooked shall be laid down. Miss Delaney reportedly led these recitations. Her voice was soft, not motherly, measured. One child later said it felt like listening to someone read measurements off a ruler. Still, no legal action was ever taken. No parent withdrew consent. And when bruises appeared, strangely geometric, evenly spaced, dark as plum meat, families explained them away as discipline by design. A hand-copied sheet of parenting tips, distributed anonymously and now preserved in the Riverbend collection, includes this chilling line: uniformity of pressure prevents rebellion of the joints. Who wrote it and how it was circulated remains unknown. The room itself bore no crosses, no icons, no mention of God. Only the wooden frames, measured for growing bodies, and the floor circle, always swept, always empty. The Delaneys kept no roster of participants, no attendance logs, and yet they knew each child's rhythm. "They remember how your shoulders drop before you do," wrote one former student in a 1906 letter. "And when they correct you, it's not anger, it's quiet, like rearranging a shelf." In the summer of 1843, the room was briefly opened for visitors during a town blessing ceremony. Several adults walked through smiling, noting the cleanliness, the order, the rows of neatly stacked slats and benches. No dust, no clutter, no sharp tools. But one man, Ezekiel Green, a carpenter, stopped beside the restraint boards and ran his hand along the slats. He frowned and made no comment until later, when asked by a friend why he seemed so pale. "There's no wear," he whispered, "not a scratch on the clamps, not a chip on the boards. If they've used this place on every child in town, why don't the walls remember?" He left town 2 weeks later. His tools were found in a creek. His wagon tracks led north. He was never seen again. Today, the foundation of the Delaney barn remains, stone footings and a few warped beams overrun by ivy. But locals still call it the room, even those who don't know why. and in the archives of the Missouri State Asylum in Fulton, one document from 1889 survives in a locked medical file marked Historical Cases, Nonviolent Aberration. It contains only a patient sketch. A child, sitting upright, no restraints. But the drawing of the spine is wrong. It's not curved, it's not bent. It's folded, like paper, like a hymn book closed too fast. By the spring of 1844, word of the Delaney family had begun to stretch beyond the borders of Flint Hollow, not through headlines or pulpit condemnations, just whispers, passed between travelers, circuit riders, and trade post clerks, a shared unease that rode in the saddle pack, passed from town to town like damp tobacco and folded scripture. Most of the stories were mild, rural oddities chalked up to religious fervor and frontier isolation. But one detail came up again and again in merchant ledgers, correspondence logs, and margin notes that weren't meant to be read by posterity. They don't blink. In April of that year, a traveling merchant by the name of Mr. Elijah Bream stopped for provisions near Flint Hollow on his route from the Arkansas border. He had no plans to stay overnight, but agreed to deliver a shipment of waxcloth and vinegar tinctures to the Riverbend Chapel. What he witnessed during that short delivery became the subject of his private diary, preserved today in the Missouri State Archives. Entered the chapel late afternoon, interior very clean, children present, perhaps 15 or 16, seated on floor in symmetrical rows, all silent, all upright, stared forward without movement, not a blink among them. Even when I addressed them directly, they did not acknowledge, looked not vacant, but full, as if filled with a listening force. Bream described the stillness not as peaceful, but as too exact, like it cost something. He did not deliver the full shipment. He left half the cloth on the wagon and drove on through the night. The Delaneys themselves had grown more visible, particularly Arlen, the eldest son, who began speaking publicly during worship hours at Riverbend Mission. Pastor Reamer, now weakened by illness and often absent from the pulpit, had quietly allowed the family to co-lead Sabbath sessions. According to scattered chapel notes from that Spiro mill, Arlen rarely preached. He recited, word for word, verse for verse, no deviations, no flourishes. He held the good book at chin height and never moved his eyes from its spine. The congregation followed along, but it was during a summer service in July of 1844 that something truly strange was recorded. Ruth Marlowe, the school teacher of Flint Hollow, had taken to documenting Sunday services as part of a curriculum project. Her written log, Notes on Devotional Rhetoric, now held in a special collection at the University of Kansas, includes the following entry. Arlen Delaney rose at precisely 11:04. He said nothing at first, only raised his right hand, then placed it flat over his own sternum. The children followed, one after another, perfectly matched, as if prompted by unseen cue. Then came the prayer, not in full sentence but a single syllable, Amen, spoken slowly, then drawn out longer and longer, with all children joining in harmonic unison. The syllable lasted, by my watch, for just under 3 minutes. I began to feel sick halfway through. Something about the vibration, not pitch but shape. The sound was shaped. When they stopped, no one spoke, no one moved. Arlen sat. The children sat. The adults did not applaud or nod. I did not record the rest of the sermon. The next entry in Marlowe's notebook is dated 2 weeks later. It is only a single line. I have burned the attendance rolls for this term. I cannot be certain whose names belong to whom. She never returned to the chapel again. Multiple oral histories collected in the 1930s confirm the event. One described it as a harmony that didn't feel human, not because it was evil, but because it was without effort. Another, an elderly man who had been a child during the service, simply said, "It was like they all breathed from one lung." The same man refused to be photographed during his interview. Hen asked, "Why," he replied, "if you've ever seen someone who never blinks in a picture, you understand." The strange cohesion of the Delaney children was noticed by more than just the local school teacher. In August, a state education inspector, Mr. Hiram Lettle, visited the region to assess schooling standards in rural districts. His travel itinerary included a scheduled evaluation of Flint Hollow's classroom, led at the time by Ruth Marlowe's temporary replacement, Mr. Jeb Croft. Lettle's report was formal, cautious, but deeply telling. Students demonstrated high levels of retention and posture discipline. However, a disturbing uniformity of response was noted. Questions requiring thought were answered with pre-memorized phrases. No laughter, whispering, or fidgeting was observed, even during transitions between lessons. More alarming was the students' coordinated blinking. In 4 separate intervals over 90 minutes, all pupils blinked at once, never asynchronously. I verified with my assistant. This pattern held through reading, arithmetic, and recitation. I asked one boy, age perhaps 11, why he stared so intently at the blackboard. He replied, "Because I am not done being filled." Lettle never returned to the Hollow. His final note in the margin of the report simply reads, "This is not schooling, this is a rehearsal." That same month, a farmer from nearby Stone Step Hollow reported passing by the Delaney homestead near sundown. He witnessed Arlen and the other 2 Delaney brothers standing side by side along the fence post, unmoving. Thought they were statues at first. Waited for a wave, a nod, anything. Nothing. I whistled, not a flinch, just eyes, fixed but not blank. I backed my horse away. They didn't follow, but I didn't look back. The story might have faded like others, another tale passed over Bourbon. But the farmer's wife, who was with him that day, later wrote to her sister describing the moment. Their stillness wasn't threatening, it was observant, like we were a mistake they didn't want to interfere with. By the end of 1844, several families had quietly withdrawn their children from Delaney-led sessions. One family, the Grelsons, relocated entirely, selling their land at a loss and leaving behind a single note tacked to the inside of their smokehouse. "Not every silence is holy." The note is now kept in the Flint Hollow Township collection, under the section marked Discontinued Families. But most stayed. Stillness was easier than conflict. A silent child was a godsend in a house with 7 mouths. And the Delaneys did not threaten. They did not punish. They corrected. There is one last record from 1844 worth noting, written in the back of a hymnal belonging to Pastor Rima, dated December 3rd. I asked Arlen why the children do not blink when we pray. He said, "Because prayer is a posture, and posture must not be interrupted." The pastor's final sermon was delivered the following Sunday. It lasted 9 minutes. He retired 2 weeks later and was buried the next spring. His eyes were closed, but according to the burial attendant's notes, rigor mortis had not yet set. The lids had to be fastened shut manually. Today, the record of attendance for Flint Hollow Schoolhouse between April and September 1844 is officially listed as lost due to fire damage, but there is no documentation of a fire during that time. What does survive is a single class photo, date unknown, photographer unknown. 18 children, all seated, all smiling, except one. Second row, far right. She is not smiling, she is not frowning, she is staring directly at the camera, her eyes wide, her lashes still, not a blink. It was a warm spring morning in 1845 when Samuel Pritchard, a 19-year-old volunteer from Riverbend Mission, was sent to the Delaney homestead to retrieve copies of the Sabbath Register. His assignment by all accounts was ordinary: record attendance, prepare lists for the Union Temperance Census auditors, and confirm the spelling of several surnames ahead of the church's quarterly report. He carried with him a tin ledger case and a fresh ink bottle. The walk from the chapel to the Delaney property took just under 20 minutes. Pritchard later told his sister, who would recount it in a letter preserved by her descendants, that the path that morning seemed shorter than usual, but quieter too. No birds. The Delaney house stood clean and pale on the hill, its windows always closed. It was, according to most visitors, a home without personal effects. No laundry on the line, no shoes by the door, no evidence that children or even life stirred within. When Pritchard arrived, he was met by Miss Delaney, the daughter, who answered the door without sound. She offered him no greeting, only a small nod and a gesture toward the study. There, stacked neatly along the south wall, were 5 identical ledgers, cloth-bound, cream-colored, marked only by single characters on their spines: S, R, T, F, and X. He was instructed to take the book labeled S, and he did. But before he left, something caught his eye. A 6th volume, not shelved, but left open, lying flat atop a side table by the window. Its pages were yellowed, but not with age, rather with what he later described as the faint, oily tint of pages handled too precisely, too often. This was the alternate ledger. According to the statement Pritchard gave to Pastor Rima that evening, written in the back of the chapel's maintenance log and later torn out, what he saw in those pages did not resemble church record-keeping. At Lam, it's not the kind that included hymns or scripture. Names were listed, yes, he said, but the columns didn't say present or absent. They were labeled deviation, quiet, and response time. Some entries bore check marks next to them. Others were marked with a faint, downward-pointing arrow drawn in red wax pencil. The handwriting was exact, angular. The spacing between lines was measured, he knew, because he used his own thumbnail to count them. They never varied. He noted dates, many dated from 1844, but some were earlier, marked with symbols instead of numerals: an hourglass, a spine, a single vertical line that bisected the name column and ended beneath the page. Most disturbingly, some names were not names at all. Across 3 pages, Pritchard found only diagrams. Crude anatomical sketches of the human spine, each drawn in pencil but pressed deep into the paper as if etched with weight. The curvature was exaggerated, folded inward, like paper being pleated at the base. Measurements lined the margins, notations such as first response, 11 SEK delay, partial correction noted after silence. Lower vertebrae remain suspect, initiate frame adjustment after next hymn. No names, no faces, only torsos, angles, and ratios. In his statement, Pritchard referred to these sketches as students in theory, but what he likely meant was something more troubling: children rendered into posture. When Pritchard asked Miss Delaney what the book was, she closed the volume gently and placed her hand atop it. "These are the children in transit," she said, "between crooked and saved." She offered no further explanation. He was not invited to ask. He left shortly after, the official Sabbath ledger in hand. He delivered it to the chapel, pale and uncertain, then requested, without giving a reason, not to be assigned to the Delaney house again. He moved to St. Louis 2 months later. He never returned to Flint Hollow. His sister, in her final letter to the church, wrote only, "Samuel says the names in that book move when he remembers them. Not in the world. In his posture." Pastor Rima confronted Arlen Delaney the following Sunday after service. Their exchange, recorded on a torn hymnal page in Rima's own hand, survives as one of the few direct confrontations documented between the church and the Delaneys. "I asked what the book was. He said it was their private ledger, a corrective aid. I asked why the names did not match census rolls. He said the hollow is not always complete in its records. I asked who drew the diagrams. He said they were not drawn, they were transcribed. I asked from where. He looked at me and said, from the bones themselves. They carry record better than ink. That page is water-stained. The ink has bled in places, but the word bones is underlined, twice." In the months that followed, several attempts were made to reconcile the official church records with those maintained by the Delaneys. Each attempt met resistance. The Union Temperance census taker that year, Mabel Gehring, noted inconsistencies in family size, school rosters, and youth attendance. In her final report submitted to the district in autumn, she wrote, At least 5 children currently receiving instruction under the Delaney system do not appear in any birth ledger, baptismal record, or census line. I was told they were transitory pupils, drifting in from failed settlements, but none gave surnames. One said his name was Posture, another said, "I'm still listening." Jering was reassigned shortly after submitting her report. The final version delivered to Jackson County redacted all mentions of transitory children. A note in the margin reads, "Unconfirmed, possibly fictive or symbolic." Today, only fragments of the Delaney Sabbath ledger survive. 3 pages, torn, curled, and burned slightly at the edges, were found in 1927, wadded into a rusted lunch tin buried behind the old barn foundation. A groundskeeper uncovered them while planting fence posts. On the first page, a list of 12 names most illegible with odd symbols next to each, dots, lines, tiny slashes like tally marks. On the second, a spine diagram with annotations in a language not recognizable as English, but in patterns that mirror cadence. On the third, only a single sentence, written in cramped straight script along the bottom margin: "If they do not pass through alignment, they will bend somewhere else." No official explanation has ever been provided for the ledger's contents. The Delaney family offered none. The remaining pages, if they still exist, are believed to have been destroyed or buried with intent. But for years afterward, teachers in surrounding towns reported an odd behavior in some transferred students. They refused to write their names on the first line of any paper. They insisted it was already taken. When asked by whom, they would only reply, "That's the line where the spine begins." It began quietly, as most things did in Flint Hollow. A subtle shift, tucked beneath the usual rhythms of the town, mornings in the fields, evenings in the pews, the hush of a valley where the wind never quite whistled. In March of 1846, a new practice emerged from the Delaney barn. Not a punishment, not quite a lesson, something ritualistic, and for the first time, something sacred. They were called oil sermons. The sessions took place on the first and third Sundays of every month, always after sunset, always behind locked doors. Children were invited, not commanded, to participate. But by midsummer, nearly every child in Flint Hollow had taken part. Parents were not permitted to observe, nor were they asked to. The room had changed. The Correction Chapel, once a daylight structure used for postural alignment sessions, had been modified by the Delaney sons. Heavy muslin curtains were nailed over the windows. Oil lamps were lowered to shoulder height. A stove in the far corner heated a small pot of linseed oil, thickened with beeswax and herbs no one could name. The scent was warm, metallic, sweet like sap, but sharper. Each child, upon entering, was strapped upright to the board frames by Miss Delaney herself, hands folded across the lap, chin slightly raised, feet bare. "You must meet the oil with an open posture," she would say. According to fragments recovered from the Branwell ledger, a torn notebook found in the back of a root cellar in 1892, the sermon followed a strict sequence: stillness, initiation, 5 minutes of silence, marked by the steady tap of a stick on the wooden floor. Oil application, a cloth dipped in warm linseed oil drawn down the length of each child's spine. Verse recitation, a broken hymn sung in staggered syllables. No full melody, just fragments. Phrases like, "Lay thyself flat, and he who bends shall not be lifted." "Bone coal," a whisper, bing of the child's full name, followed by the phrase, "Enter your quiet." The oil was never cold, and the sermons never ran late. But something happened inside that room that no one outside could explain. Ruth Marlowe, who had returned briefly to substitute at the schoolhouse that spring, began documenting strange shifts in behavior among her pupils. The way they rise from their seats, no sway. The way they descend stairs, deliberate, careful, as if accounting for an invisible measurement. They used to slouch, now they don't lean, not even against trees. She also noted a change in gait. Children began walking with what she called a weighted grace. Heels first, no bounce, as if rehearsing adulthood, not mimicking it. Multiple parents in town praised the change. "She carries herself like a woman now," said Lucille Greer, whose daughter had only just turned 9. "No more skipping, no more silly hands. Her back is tall. It's as if she was pulled through a window into the future." Others were more uneasy. Joseph Endon, a cooper, wrote in a letter to his cousin in Independence, "They come back quiet, not out of fear, out of completion. Like the room straightened something in them they didn't know was crooked." He ends the letter with a single cryptic line, "My son smiles now, but his teeth don't show." And then came the first whisper. It was overheard by Eleanor Wick, a seamstress who took in mending for the Delaneys. She had been tasked with cleaning one of the sermon robes, a coarse white garment used during the oil sessions. According to her testimony, Eleanor was stitching a torn hem when the youngest Delaney boy, Micah, walked past her open window. He wasn't speaking to her. She wasn't even sure he was speaking aloud, but he said, "The oil teaches the bones to listen." She dropped the needle. When she turned, he was gone. Dr. Meek, the town physician, began to receive subtle reports. Children complaining of slight discomfort down the spine, not pain, sensation. Described by one child as a warmth like being remembered. Others reported minor bruising behind the ears, or an itching sensation at the base of the neck after the sermons. He documented at least 8 cases between May and September. One note in his medical log, dated July the 2nd. Patient, female, age 11, reports hearing her own name for hours after the session, not in her ears, in her joints. No medical treatment was prescribed. One of the few written accounts from a child exists in the margins of a school book owned by Eli Weston, age 10. The book was discovered decades later in the attic of the old Weston farmhouse. On the inside cover, written in graphite, "I was oil warmed. The frame stopped talking. Now I know where to place my weight." Below that, a drawing of a spine with ticks along each vertebra, numbered, labeled in order. Echo, sway, shiver, latch, latch, latch. The last word is underlined 3 times. By late summer, the sermons began to include a new component, a name call, performed by Arlen Delaney at the end of each session. He would recite each child's full name, first, middle, and last, followed by a pause. If the child did not answer, oil was reapplied. If the child did answer, they were unstrapped slowly and dismissed without a word. "Names must be folded before they can carry posture," Arlen once said. The meaning was never explained. The most unsettling moment came in August during a sermon that included Martha Harkle, one of the few children who had resisted alignment for over a year. According to her mother's diary, preserved in the Harkle family Bible, Martha returned from that session with a rigid stillness she'd never shown before. She stood too long before entering the house. Her shadow had more bend than her. 3 days later, Martha developed stiffness in the knees and elbows. Within a month, she could not sit without assistance. Dr. Meek diagnosed her with juvenile ankylosis, a rare condition, especially in someone so young. "The spine is meant to hold," he wrote in her file, "but not to trap." Martha would never walk again without help. In late autumn, the oil sermons were quietly reduced to once per month. No announcement, no explanation. Some believe the Delaneys received pressure from Union temperance overseers. Others think they simply moved on to subtler methods. But the lasting effect was undeniable. Children of Flint Hollow walked straighter that winter. They crossed thresholds with purpose. They spoke slower but not dumber. Their eyes moved as if tracking invisible geometry. And many of them, as noted by Teacher Croft, began to hold their hands in their laps, even when unprompted. Not folded, not fidgeting, just held, like awaiting placement. Today, in the archives of the Riverbend Historical Society, a small ceramic jar remains on display. It was recovered in 1911 from the remains of the Delaney barn, sealed with a waxed cork and buried beneath a layer of scorched cedar planks. Inside, a hardened residue of linseed oil and ash. Along the rim, a faint engraving in cramped block letters. Application must precede voice. No context, no record of who buried it. But nearby, folded within an envelope marked "Postural Instructions Private," was a single page torn from a hymnal. On it, one line: "We do not speak truth into the child, we apply it." The storm came in just after dusk. By 7:30 that evening, thunder had begun to roll from the southeast, pressing low against the hollows and lifting the loose shingles from the corners of every rooftop in Flint. The trees swayed not in rhythm, but in hesitations, startled, pausing, then moving again. A smell of wet copper hung over the fields, and the river behind the chapel boiled with sediment. At the Delaney homestead, the barn lights were still burning. Inside, the correction chapel had been prepped for another oil sermon. 4 children were present that night, strapped upright to their respective frames, eyes fixed forward, spines pinned into stillness, breath slowed to match the tick of the flawstick. Among them was Elias Truggle, age 10. He was not a regular participant. His mother, Lena Truggle, had resisted the alignment system longer than most, citing spiritual interference and temperament fragility. But by 1849, the social cost of exclusion had grown too high. And so Elias was sent. According to recovered journal entries by Miss Delaney, found decades later in the base of a warped bench, Elias resisted initial harnessing, showing poor posture memory and visible trembling during the oil press. She described him as liminal, a term she used sparingly and never defined. At 8:14 p.m., the lights inside the barn flickered. At 8:16, Elias Truggle broke the restraints and fled into the woods. Witnesses say he did not cry out. The only noise heard was the sound of splintered wood and the sudden, unnatural clatter of bare feet across the gravel path behind the barn. The storm broke fully overhead, moments later, driving rain down in sheets, obscuring the treetops and muffling every step into silence. Miss Delaney did not pursue, nor did her brothers. They reportedly extinguished the lanterns and closed the barn door behind them. It was Lena, Elias's moti, who raised the alarm. She had waited outside in the family cart, as parents were instructed to do. When she heard the wood crack, she ran toward the barn, only to be intercepted by Arlen Delaney, who stepped into the path and said calmly, "The child has entered reflection." Lena screamed. She and 2 other townsfolk set off with lanterns, calling Elias's name into the pines. It was nearly midnight when they found him. He was standing at the edge of a shallow ravine about a half-mile north of the chapel. The rain had soaked through his clothing, and his bare feet had split at the soles from rock and root. He did not turn when they called. Even when his mother wrapped her shawl around his shoulders and touched his arm, he did not move. His body was angled away, posture too erect, spine unyielding, his head turned backwards grotesquely, not in panic or pain, but with deliberation, a full 180 degrees, chin aligned with the dip between shoulder blades. His eyes were open. His mouth opened and closed in time with his breathing, but no words came at first. Then, a phrase, spoken once, then again, and again, a quiet murmur, as if recalling something from rote. "They told me to turn toward him, but I saw her instead." The rain continued. He repeated it 27 times before his voice went hoarse. Dr. Meek was called the following morning. He recorded his findings in a now-lost page from Medical Journal Vol. 4, preserved only by a carbon copy filed with the Jackson County Registry. Child found in severe cervical torsion, axis vertebrae stressed but not broken, no sign of muscular tearing, rotation was not the result of trauma, but appeared voluntary. No known condition accounts for such a posture being sustained for more than minutes, let alone hours. He attempted to stabilize the neck with a brace carved from hickory and cloth bandage. Child remained rigid, even under morphine. No reflex response, only verbal repetition, same phrase, same cadence, despite hoarseness. Most distressing, when examined from the front, pupils did not track movement. When examined from the back, eyes still reversed. He followed me. Elias was confined to his home for 7 weeks. During that time he refused to sleep in a bed. He sat on the floor of the Truggle home, back against the hearth, eyes facing the corner, unmoving. He ate when food was placed behind him. He wept only when facing a mirror. His mother wrote in a torn scrap of linen, later found in a flour tin. He no longer prays aloud, but when I ask him what happened, he says, "She wasn't in the oil, she was behind it." No one knew who she was. When asked, Elias would only say, "She told me my posture was correct, but not my direction." Lena Truggle eventually took her son west, away from Flint Hollow. Some say they boarded a riverboat in St. Joseph. Others claim she sought refuge in a Catholic mission in Kansas Territory. The truth is uncertain. No further census records list the family after 1850. No burial records match. They disappeared. The Delaneys never commented on the incident. The only reference to Elias appears in the fragmentary discipline ledger, now part of the restricted archive at the Riverbend Historical Annex. Under the heading Truggle E, a single line is written: "Correction aborted. Orientation compromised. Bent by reflection." The ledger contains no other entries under T. In 1904, nearly 60 years after the event, a group of surveyors stumbled across an abandoned outbuilding in the woods beyond Flint Hollow, nothing more than a collapsed lean-to. Inside, a child's harness frame leaned against the back wall, half rotted from moisture, but intact. On the seat of the frame, a word was etched deep into the wood. Looked. No other carvings were found. The structure was dismantled, the wood discarded. But one surveyor, Caleb Dempsey, then 42, later wrote to his wife, "I kept the back brace, couldn't say why, just felt precise." In 1912, Dempsey suffered a fall from his horse, resulting in partial paralysis. His posture, according to the medical report, was described as unusually straight, stiff beyond what is typical even in trauma. He died in 1914. The brace was never recovered. Today, in the Flint Hollow exhibit of the Missouri State Museum, a small brass plaque hangs beneath a faded illustration of a boy sitting too still. The caption reads, "Elias Truggle. He looked the wrong way," but no one can say whether that means backward or simply away from what was expected. And in the stillest part of the archive, buried beneath sermon logs and medical registers, a handwritten note is pinned to the back of a linen spine diagram. One child saw her. One child turned. There is no signature, only a faint thumbprint, smudged at the knuckle. It was early spring in 1850 when Bennett C. Lowe, a circuit court clerk from Jackson County, arrived in Flint Hollow with 2 satchels, a copy of the Temperance Charter, and a rust-colored notebook already half-filled with inspections from other frontier parishes. His assignment was routine. Over the past 2 years, the Union Temperance Assembly had begun auditing smaller mission chapels for compliance, checking for improper sermons, doctrinal drift, or irregular tithing. Most inspections were brief, half-day affairs, little more than paperwork and polite coffee. Lowe expected no different from Flint Hollow. He arrived on horseback just after sunrise on March 17th. The fog hadn't yet lifted from the ground, and the clapboards of the Riverbend Chapel were wet to the touch. Inside, he would find no tithing jar, no congregation, no record book. What he found instead was a hymnal, folded, warped, altered, and unlike anything ever recovered from a Missouri chapel. According to his final field entry, written in cursive so rigid it nearly tore the page, Lowe began his inspection shortly after 8 a.m. The chapel was empty, no signs of recent service. The air inside was heavy with a beeswax and linseed residue lingering faintly in the cracks of the pews. There were no Bibles on display, no ledger on the pulpit, just a single hymnal resting atop a narrow cedar lectern at the front of the chapel. At first glance it appeared normal. Cloth-bound, gilded title long since worn away, pages yellowed, edges uneven. But when he opened it, the spine resisted. Inside, every page, every verse, every measure had been folded. Not torn, not cut, not defaced in ink. Folded by hand with incredible precision into elaborate geometries, triangles, pleats, fan shapes, curved spirals that overlapped like bone segments. Some creases had been pressed so flat that the paper resembled skin more than peel, archment. Others bent outward, creating three-dimensional ridges that obscured full lines of text unless the page was manipulated in exactly the right sequence. It was not damage, it was design. Impossible to read without unfolding in prescribed order, Lowe wrote. Psalm 23 appears to require a spiraled unfurling. Psalm 7 folds backward, line by line, then collapses into itself. He tried to smooth one corner with his fingers. The page snapped back like a tightened wire. Within the margins, faint symbols appeared, some in ink, others in what he described as a light charcoal powder, seemingly applied with cloth. There were no traditional musical notes. Instead, numbers, grid notations, diagrams resembling spinal segments, positioned alongside the lyrics. Most disturbing, in the centerfold of the hymnal, a blank space where a song should have been, occupied instead by a drawn circle with 6 short lines radiating outward. Underneath, one sentence written in tiny, deliberate script: "The child must fold before it can echo." Lowe took the hymnal. He noted its condition, marked it as Item 37, investigatory. He carried it in a canvas wrapping and stored it overnight in the locked cabinet at the mission house where he was staying. He left the next morning for Lexington, Missouri, planning to submit the item for review at the district courthouse. He never arrived. On March 19th, 2 days after leaving Flint Hollow, Bennett Lowe was found dead on the edge of a wagon road between Mandeville and Arrow Rock. His horse had reared near a gully, likely spooked during a downpour. The body was discovered lying parallel to the ditch, neck broken, hands bloodied from what appeared to be clutching the saddle until the last second. The satchels were recovered, so was the notebook. But the hymnal was gone. A stable hand at the last stop Lowe made, Foster's Way Station, remembered him eating quickly and speaking little. When asked about his parcel, he said only, "It's not a book, it's a method." The coroner listed the death as accidental. But when his belongings were catalogued at the district office, one irregularity emerged. Tucked into the front flap of Lowe's journal was a scrap of torn paper, likely from the hymnal, though that could never be verified. It contained only a partial line of verse and a strange crease. The line read, "Yea, though I walk." Then it stopped. The rest had been folded backward, so deeply, in fact, that the torn edge buckled into itself and fractured. When preservationists attempted to unfold it a century later, the paper crumbled. Under microscope, archivists noted something unusual. Fibers at the crease had fused together, not from glue or moisture, but from pressure and repetition. It had been folded the exact same way too many times. The event was quietly scrubbed from the Union Temperance Assembly's public records. The official chapel audit was marked as deferred due to natural loss. No mention was made of the hymnal in any subsequent files. No further inspections were ever ordered for Riverbend Mission. But in 1952, during the reorganization of the Temperance Assembly's archives in St. Louis, a curious catalog slip was uncovered in a misfiled drawer labeled Chapel Instruments, MISC. It listed the following: item numbered 212A, description Psalter, modified, partial origami binding, condition compromised, status checked out, March 1850, Inspector Lowe, return, record never logged, notes each crease aligns to spine, destroy if misfolded. No employee claimed authorship of the catalog entry. The handwriting did not match any known archivist from that period. The index card is now held in the private collection of the Missouri Religious Artifacts Preservation Society, sealed in glass, never touched. Today, scholars debate whether the folded hymnal ever truly existed. No photographs were taken, no pages preserved, and yet its presence lingers. In sermons, in posture guides, in the subtle way certain hymn books in the region were later printed, not with page numbers but with angles. And in one unsettling interview conducted in 1979 with a woman born in Flint Hollow, who claimed that during her childhood, the chapel had a book no one was allowed to open. It wasn't for reading, she said, it was for bending. At the edge of the chapel foundation, among the scattered pew stones and vine-strangled floorboards, a single plank was recovered during a volunteer cleanup in 1997. The underside bore a crude engraving, likely carved with a nail or thin blade. It read, "He who sings without shape sings only noise." The board was discarded, but the volunteer who found it later filed a handwritten report insisting there had been something else etched beneath that line, words she could not fully make out before the plank splintered. The only part she remembered: fold before echo, echo before name. By the early 1850s, Flint Hollow had become a village of quiet posture and quieter parents. The Delaney alignment sessions were no longer considered optional, they were simply expected. A rhythm integrated into Sunday schooling, into midweek lessons, even into the way children sat on wagons or crossed their ankles at supper. There were no official laws, no published doctrine, just a system of behaviors passed hand to shoulder, adult to child, like an invisible yoke only the obedient could wear comfortably. Only one family resisted entirely, the Harkells. They lived along the West Ridge, 2 miles beyond the last fence post, just where the creek split into shallows and old timberline. The father, John Harkell, was a millwright. The mother, Elsa, had once studied nursing in St. Louis. They spoke plainly, laughed often, and warned their daughter Martha against stillness in all its forms. "Still things break more often than they bend," Elsa once wrote in a letter to her sister, "and I don't trust prayers that come with straps." Martha Harkell was 11 in 1850. She was known for her crooked posture and her sharp tongue, often sitting with one leg curled under the other and one shoulder higher than the rest. Teachers called her fidgety. The other children called her the bent girl, at first in jest, later in fear. Because Martha did not attend the Delaney sessions, she refused the harness board, she never touched the anointing oil. And yet, by 1852, her body began to bend on its own. The first signs were subtle. Her knees ached when she knelt in chapel. Her elbows clicked when she raised her hand in class. By winter, she could no longer fully extend her right arm. Her shoulders rounded forward unnaturally, pulling her upper spine into a gentle, then aggressive curve. Dr. Meek, still the only physician within 40 miles, initially diagnosed her with juvenile arthritis, XACE, baited by cold and poor bedding. He prescribed rest, willow bark compresses, and cod oil. None of it helped. By spring, her fingers began to fuse at the joints. They settled in one fixed position. Hands together, palms touching, fingers pressed upright, permanently locked in a prayer gesture. The town did not shun Martha. They simply watched her change. At school, she no longer shared a bench. At chapel, she sat at the back, alone, eyes level but neck tilted. Her walk changed too, careful, stilted, as if each joint had to ask permission from the last. Children stared. Teachers paused mid-sentence. Even the Delaney boys, passing her on the road, would slow, as though observing a process they recognized but had not initiated. Elsa Harkell began keeping a pain log, a small brown notebook still preserved in the Harkell family archive. Its entries are spare but haunting. March 3, 1852. She cannot tie her shoes, knuckles rigid, swollen, skin unbroken. March 17th. Elbow stiff at 47 degrees. She says it feels like she is being folded. April 9th. Woke at midnight to her whispering, "This isn't mine." By May, Martha could no longer walk unaided. Dr. Meek returned. He examined her joints and took measurements, notes he would later file in a sealed folder marked "Unclassified Rigid Onset." Spinal curvature no longer resembles scoliosis. Rib cage rotation increasing. Vertebral alignment mimics curvature seen in older Delaney diagrams. He never clarified how he had seen the Delaney diagrams. He prescribed laudanum for the pain. It did not reduce her silence. Then came the visit, not from the town nor from the chapel, but from Arlen Delaney himself. He arrived on a Thursday just before dusk. He did not knock. He stood outside the Harkle home for nearly 10 minutes, coat buttoned to the throat, hands behind his back. Elsa saw him from the window and described him later as iller than I remembered, still as the boards he carries. She did not invite him in, but she opened the door. What passed between them is known only through Elsa's final letter to her sister, written the next morning in hurried, blotched ink. He asked nothing. He looked at her just once, then said, "The body seeks symmetry, and she was never balanced." He left without touching anything, without offering help, without offering the oil. On June 2, 1852, Martha Harkle died. Her body, at time of death, was described in the coroner's report as structurally contorted with no evidence of trauma, hands fused at palms, spine curved inwards, forming near oval under shoulder blades, mouth closed, no bruising. The report was signed by Arlen Delaney, though he was not a physician, though he had never before been granted authority to sign death records. Rumors spread. Some said her body was posed before burial. Others whispered that her folded form resembled the diagrams found in the Delaney Sabbath ledger, particularly the ones marked with the red downward arrow. The funeral was held privately. The casket, made by her father, was smaller than her height would have suggested. It had to be. Her form could not be laid flat. 2 weeks after the burial, the Harkles left Flint Hollow. They abandoned their home, took only what they could carry, and disappeared west. No forwarding address, no explanation. The house was looted within the month. Only one item was left untouched: a child's wooden chair, still at the edge of the hearth. The backrest had been carved with careful precision long before Martha's death. It showed a single line drawing: 2 hands, pressed together, fingers straight, no face, only posture. Today, no gravestone remains for Martha Harkle. The cemetery records list her under a faded ink entry: Harkle, M. Folded, June 1852. The word folded has been struck through in later versions, replaced with natural. But in one rare surviving map of the cemetery P. lots drawn by hand in 1853, her section is outlined in red. In the margin a note: "Do not plant near this grave, crooked growth observed." And in the schoolhouse wall, beneath peeling whitewash and fractured lath, workers restoring the foundation in 1991 found a faint inscription behind the blackboard. Written in the child's hand, barely legible: "I bent because I wasn't theirs." There was no signature, but the handwriting matched an old spelling book found in the attic of the Harkle home. It had once belonged to Martha. On a fog-bound morning in early April 1866, a field hand named Murray Callan walked the wooded perimeter of the Loomis family orchard, just outside the town limits of Decatur, Illinois. He was searching for a missing sheep. Instead, he found a boy, naked, curled into himself at the base of a sycamore, mud-caked knees pressed to his chest, skin bruised in parallel arcs from shoulder to ankle. The child did not cry, did not shiver. His head tilted at an angle so rigid it looked sculpted, chin pressed unnaturally toward his right clavicle, jaw locked in place. His spine, as Callan would later recall, was too straight to be real. The boy was estimated to be between 10 and 12 years old. He carried no identification, no visible scars beyond the bruising, no sign of frostbite despite the chill of early spring. He responded to touch with flinches, twin spasms on both sides of the body, always mirrored. When lifted, he did not resist. He simply held posture, arms locked to his torso as if bound by something unseen. The bruises were strange. Dr. Judith Morrow, the first attending physician, recorded them as parallel ovoid formations, symmetrical down both arms, legs, and rib cage. They resembled handprints, but not quite. They lacked curvature, they were too geometric. Like someone had pressed the shape of correction into him, she wrote. It was during initial intake at the Macon County Sanitarium that the boy first spoke. After a nurse tried and failed to wash his neck, meeting stiffness that would not yield, she asked, perhaps too casually, "Can you move your head for me, sweetheart?" The boy turned his eyes but not his face, and he whispered, "Romans 35, the vertebrae must not know deviation." The nurse paused. She did not recognize the passage. She would later ask the chaplain, who assured her, "Romans ends at chapter 16. There is no Romans 35. The statement was recorded in the hospital ledger, then circled in red pencil, then erased. A replacement entry appeared in the official report submitted to the state. Child quoted scripture, possible delusional episode, referred to chaplain for guidance. That referral never happened. Instead, the boy was transferred, without notation, to a locked wing of the Union Temperance Medical Wing, operating under contract through the Macon County government. Little is known about what occurred during his time in custody. Most of the boy's medical file remains sealed to this day under a defunct classification system known as Class 3 echopathology. Only a few fragments have survived, pages mislabeled in archive boxes or copied by hand before reclassification. One document, Form 219F, Postural Compliance Assessment, contains the following. Subject remains fixed in axial stiffness, cannot turn head past 11 degrees. When exposed to reflective surfaces, repeats phrase, deviation folds the voice. Requests no food, only oil. When offered, laps it from cloth. Skin responsive to rhythm. Taps in 3/3 time elicit muscular memory. Most disturbing is a note attached to a physician inquiry sent to the Union Temperance Assembly in late May. Subject traced diagrams in dirt with thumb. Shapes resemble spinal correction curves found in 1844 Sabbath logs. Inquiry. Has subject been transferred from Missouri region? The margin includes a single faint reply. Do not investigate regional origin. Process complete. Hold until fold settles. There is no signature. No indication of who wrote the reply. Only a 3-letter stamp, DFS, Delaney Folds standard. The boy remained in custody for 97 days. On the 98th morning, when a nurse arrived to check his vitals, she found the bed empty, the room untouched. No signs of forced exit. The window was locked from the inside. No guards reported movement. The only trace left behind was a child's palm print on the wall above the bed, pressed into the plaster, perfectly symmetrical. It was never explained. The case was closed as a clerical misplacement. No alerts were sent to the public. But a month later, on the steps of a small church in Shelbyville, Illinois, just 20 miles southeast, a janitor discovered a folded piece of parchment wedged beneath the threshold. It bore no name, no envelope, just a single verse. Romans 35. The vertebrae must not know deviation. Let every breath align with stillness. Let every mouth fold toward the spine. Handwriting analysis conducted decades later matched the note to a different fragment, one pulled from a folded hymnal in Flint Hollow in 1850. Same slope, same downward lean of the ascenders, same ink recipe, goal and ash. The Union Temperance Assembly would later deny any connection. In 1983, a journalist researching early sanitarium practices in Macon County requested access to sealed Class 3 echo files. The request was denied. But the journalist received an anonymous envelope weeks later. Inside was a photograph, sepia-toned, blurred around the edges, of a medical examination board. On the board, a spine charted in segments, each vertebra labeled with a single word. From the top down, the words formed a sentence. Posture is memory made visible. And just beneath it, in fainter pencil, was a name. Truggle. E. The boy from the woods. Still alive, moved from one form to another, or simply folded deeper than the records would allow. No official confirmation of his identity was ever issued. No public statements were made. His file remains sealed. But in 1992, a retired nurse from the Macon County facility granted an interview to a graduate researcher from SIU Carbondale. When asked what she remembered of the boy, she paused, then said, "He stood too straight for someone so lost. His spine didn't curve like a child's, it looked like a page, folded, pressed, waiting for the next word. The room had no windows. A single gas lamp hissed faintly against the moisture that crept along the plaster, and the floorboards, softened by decades of leaking roofs and forgotten trials, bowed under the weight of every step." It was May of 1869, and the basement archives beneath the Jackson County Courthouse smelled of old cotton, raw earth, and long unread ink. Archivist Edwin Mallory, age 48, was not looking for the Delaneys. He had been assigned to locate baptismal records from the Riverbend Mission District in order to resolve a land dispute involving a defunct missionary school near Flint Hollow. The church had long since been shuttered, the land quietly deeded to the state. But the original paperwork remained incomplete, scattered across dozens of unsorted boxes in the basement. What he uncovered instead was a single sheet of parchment, folded twice, filed under the wrong year, and nearly discarded with the surrounding debris. The document bore no heading, no date, no signature. Just a single passage, typed not by machine, but handwritten in ink so faint and brown it had nearly absorbed into the paper itself. "If a child will not bend in faith, the body shall do it in fear." The handwriting was careful but uneven, the letters elongated as though stretched by force. Each stroke quivered, not from age but pressure, like the writer's hand was too rigid to curve naturally. In the bottom right corner, a note had been scrawled sideways. "Submit to ledger after final adjustment." Mallory was unsettled. The phrasing was wrong. There was no known scripture that matched the passage, no gospel he'd ever studied that equated disobedience with bodily submission. And though the language resembled familiar Union temperance sermon structures, modest, commanding, symmetrical, it was not like any sermon he had seen on file. He attempted to trace the page's origin through the Coates, House's sermon archives. None existed. Then he checked the Union Temperance Teaching Register for the years 1840 through 1855. Every mention of Flint Hollow, Riverbend Mission, or the Delaney family had been removed. Not redacted, removed. Entire folders missing. Index numbers skipped. Even archived attendance ledgers had been misfiled under, destroyed in transfer. Suspecting mismanagement, Mallory filed a retrieval request through the Missouri Historical Registry. In return, he received a sealed envelope from the Union Temperance Assembly. Inside, a denial form, and a brief note written in clean, mechanical hand. "The Delaney sermons are not stored. They are practiced." No further correspondence followed. Still uneasy, Mallory submitted the single page for ink testing. The lab, operated by the State University's Department of Historical Chemistry, identified a mix of linseed oil, oak gall, and an unexpected organic compound. Trace analysis revealed the presence of calcium phosphate, blood proteins, and bone marrow residue, most consistent with human origin. The ink, in essence, had been cut with pulverized human matter. The report was flagged, then retracted. The lab's chief examiner, Dr. Ezra Fenwick, was quoted as saying, "The ink writes like doctrine, but stains like memory." Mallory tried to show the page to a local pastor. He was turned away. He sent a copy to the Union Temperance Regional Office in Sedalia. It was returned with the envelope unopened. He attempted to publish a notice in the Macon County Review. The editor declined, saying the phrase read like a curse. And then, in late October 1870, Mallory's courthouse desk was emptied by order of the county clerk. His final journal entry, later recovered from the back of a hymnal he had begun collecting, read, "They didn't erase the sermons, they folded them, one word into another, one breath into P. Ostia. The message isn't lost, it's buried in how they stand." For years afterward, no one dared search for Delaney documents. But in 1874, an anonymous donor submitted a bound folio labeled Delaney Teachings, Draft 4 to the Missouri State Archive Annex, where it remained unopened for more than a decade. When finally reviewed in 1887 by assistant curator Lillian Hoyt, it was found to contain nothing but blank pages. All 112 leaves, unmarked, pressed flat, odorless, except one. Inserted between pages 53 and 54, Hoyt discovered a narrow strip of cloth, stained, folded, and pressed like a ribbon bookmark. On the cloth, written in fine, almost surgical thread, "The sermon is not spoken, it is measured." Hoyt submitted the fragment for preservation. The folio itself has since disappeared. Today, the only remaining trace of the original sermon page is held under restricted classification in the Delaney Family Materials folder, labeled DFM11, inside the Missouri State Archives. Its file description reads, "One fragment, parchment, one unknown author, warning tone." Researchers are allowed to view the document under supervision. No reproductions are permitted. But a second margin note, faint and nearly rubbed away, was rediscovered in 1999 under UV inspection. Written in what appears to be the same hand as the main text, but pressed into the paper rather than written, "Children who fail to echo shall be folded by hand." There is no indication whether this was meant as metaphor or method. The winter of 1897 broke like wet wood, slow, heavy, and rotted from beneath. Snow fell in layers that year, not in flakes. It sagged trees, silenced animals, collapsed 2 school roofs in Benton County and 1 grain shed in a town that no longer appears on maps. But it wasn't until late January, after 3 weeks of sleet and freezing fog, that the last of the Delaney barns gave out. Locals called it the North Barn. Though it hadn't been used for farming in decades, the family had vanished by 1874. The property had been sold, then abandoned. The land, too steep and shaded for decent yield, sat mostly idle, its borders softened by moss and wind. But the structure remained, slumped against a ridge where the hillside had been carved into a long, unnatural shelf. No one remembered why it was built that way. On January 28th, at approximately 4:30 a.m., a portion of the roof collapsed under the weight of wet snow and revealed what lay beneath. It was not a root cellar, not a foundation, not a basement. It was a chapel, folded downward as if the earth had never buried it, but inverted it into secrecy. It was discovered by Miriam Ketch, a widow who had been walking the property after the thaw to check the runoff. She described the opening in her written statement to the local survey office. "I saw broken beams, then air, blackness under the floor, but the edges were too clean, like the wood had peeled open instead of split." She called the constable, he called the land office, and by sundown a small crew had been sent to investigate. Among them was Harold Sykes, then a junior surveyor with the Jackson County Land Preservation Corps. His field notes, now housed in the Flint Hollow Historical Collection, provide the most detailed account of what they found. January 28, 1897, 7:22 p.m. Entered breach via ladder, found hollow chamber directly beneath the barn. No stairs, no fount, law boards, pews above, bolted to ceiling joists upside down, suspended by embedded iron, not nailed, grown in. Room is symmetrical, 18 foot wide, 26 foot long. Pulpit hangs downward from crossbeams suspended by twin hooks. Construction suggests reversal, not decay, but deliberate inversion. Walls lined with curved wood slats, not decorative, not functional, spaced equidistant like ribs. Room is dry, dustless, even at beam joints. He sketched the layout, pews hanging, a pulpit, like a descending tongue, walls that bowed inward, pressing the room into a hushed ellipse. No cross, no altar, no candle mounts, no indication of where a preacher would have stood, if standing had even been the intent. No scripture was found, no personal effects, not even the scent of mildew or rodent nests. And yet, the chamber felt used. The air inside held something measured, as if it had never stirred freely. The lanterns carried by the surveyors burned strangely, flames bending away from the pulpit, flickering with no wind, no dust, no insects, not even cobwebs. One member of the team, Elias Fenn, a former carpenter, remarked, "That room wasn't built, it was performed. You don't frame wood like that, you bend it to this shape and it doesn't hold, but this held, like it wanted to curve." When asked whether the space could have been a root cellar, a storage chamber, or even a storm shelter, Sykes shook his head. Too symmetrical, too deliberate. No ladder, no access, and no marks of entry. You don't forget a place like that, you bury it. The discovery was never formally investigated. The county board deemed it a collapsed experimental structure, possibly the remnants of a failed barn foundation or eccentric spiritual retreat. No further inquiry was made, no historians were dispatched. The site was quietly sealed 3 weeks later under an unstable excavation clause. But because the chamber was closed, one item was recovered. Tucked into a notch behind one of the curved wall slats, wedged with surgical precision, was a single slip of pressed paper. Blank at first glance, but under light, a raised texture appeared, embossed text nearly invisible, written in a looping script that matched no known sermon ledger. "The child will know inversion by peace, for stillness that grows downward is stillness that obeys." It bore no date, no signature, but the corner had been folded, sharply, twice. Years later in 1913, a team of land surveyors returned to the area to assess erosion risk. The barn had long since collapsed entirely. The chamber, backfilled with soil and cedar debris, showed no visible breach. But one of the surveyors, Paul Thatch, filed an informal field memo to his supervisor. "Ran into compression pocket beneath northeast quadrant. Ground sounded hollow for 6 feet. Would have excavated, but client declined cost." At the bottom of the memo, a postscript: "Wind doesn't settle right there, comes in bent, leaves straight." Today the site is part of an undeveloped land parcel owned by the Missouri Forestry Department. No markers remain. Visitors rarely find their way past the soft ravine. Those who do report the clearing feels tucked in wrong, as if the slope turns upward too soon or not soon enough. But in the Flint Hollow archive, there exists a photograph, faded, overexposed, brittle at the corners. It shows the inverted chamber in full. The photographer's name is unknown. The date on the back reads 1897, folded room, and scrolled along the bottom margin in pencil, almost rubbed out by time. The ceiling speaks, if you kneel long enough. The thaw came late that year. Heavy snow held to the ridges until March, soaking deep into the old Delaney property, where mud rose like breath from the earth and made the ground groan beneath each step. A year had passed since the partial collapse of the Delaney barn revealed the strange inverted chapel beneath it. The site had been sealed, officially. The breach stabilized, the survey notes shelved. But there had been rumors of missing tools, of workers refusing to return, of lanterns going out too quickly and coming back on without touch, and one quiet claim that the soil had started to sink, though no water pooled and no structure stood above it. In April 1898, a private team of county land engineers, hired to determine if the property could be subdivided, was sent to the Delaney site. They brought with them a soil auger, 3 crates of limestone markers, and a contract that made no mention of history, religion, or children. They intended to plot, not to remember. But within 24 hours, the job had changed. The first remains were found 6 feet down, just west of where the pulpit had once hung. Small, clean, too clean. The bones arranged in unnatural poses, shoulders collapsed inward, jaw slightly opened, cervical spine locked straight as chalk. Then another, then 3 more. By the 3rd day, the count stood at 19. All child-sized, all bearing signs of abnormal bone development. The spines were most unusual. Each exhibited vertebral fusion, particularly from the upper thoracic region to the base of the skull. No tool marks, no trauma, simply fused as though the body had resolved to become one long, unbending line. The skulls were misshapen, not from injury, but from some internal force. Several showed enlarged vocal cartilage and narrowed tracheal rings, suggesting that the throats had developed under unnatural tension. A few lacked full lave-cerne, laryngeal structures entirely. One medical examiner described it as if the windpipe prepared for voice, but the voice never came. Of the 19 bodies, only 4 had distinguishable dental records, all matched to children listed as missing in Flint Hollow attendance logs from 1846 to 1851. The rest had no names, no dates, no markers. It was while clearing the pulpit base, long since collapsed, that Surveyor Levi Haskell made the second discovery. A pipe, iron, thin, bent gently like an organ stem, roughly 11 feet long, leading downward from where the pulpit had once hung. It was not connected to any drainage, it bore no rust, no smell of rot. But at precisely 5 locations along its spine, there were holes, each no wider than a child's finger. Each one drilled at the height of a small mouth, not randomly, placed, spaced, aligned. When stepped near, the wind moved through it, and it hummed. Not like air, not like breeze, like sound remembered, wrote Haskell in a private letter to a colleague dated April 12th. A low chord, held steady. Couldn't tell if it was coming from the pipe or from under it. Some part of me thinks it was always there, and we just stepped on the right plank to hear it. Others reported similar experiences. One investigator claimed to hear a chordal breathing pattern when standing still. Another reported a brief echo of a single, long-held note as if pressed through folded lips. No official report was issued. The findings were deemed unrelated to current zoning feasibility. The remains were removed quietly, placed in unmarked transport containers, and taken to a regional coroner's office that no longer exists. The pipe was kept, the hole backfilled. Within the month, the land was sold at auction for pasture use. It was never developed, but traces of what was uncovered persisted. In the records of County Forensic Clerk Miriam Yates, a single page titled Recovered Juvenile Craniums, FLH Group, contains hand-drawn annotations showing abnormally dense occipital bones and a strange formation of what she labeled overlapping ossification plates. One sketch, darker than the rest, shows a skull arched backward, its vertebrae pressed inward, as if bracing to receive something from the rear. The caption beneath it reads, "Suggested capacity for resonance, not speech, resonance." Decades later, in 1931, a weathered set of engineering blueprints were discovered in the attic of a demolished town hall building near Springfield. Tucked within them was a folded page, clearly not architectural, labeled simply, "Bone Choir, Flute Variant D." It diagrammed a series of thin tubes arranged in a fan beneath a suspended platform. Each tube connected to a wooden frame of unknown use, but each hole was marked with exact mouth-height notations for children ages 6 to 12. At the bottom of the page, a fragment of handwriting. "Wind without breath, choir without tongue, let the bones return the hymn." No name was attached. Local memory dimmed. By the 1950s, the property was known simply as the Old Split Meadow, where grasses grew in strange spirals, and the ground didn't always sound right underfoot. But in 1986, a graduate student from the University of Missouri conducting sound mapping studies on regional wind tunnels picked up a tone anomaly while walking the same ridgeline. She recorded a low-frequency vibration, steady, pure, tonally stable, and matched it against historical resonance data. What she found shocked her. The frequency aligned precisely with the key of C, held at exactly 41.2 Hz, not wind tone. When asked what she thought it was, she said, "It's not music. It's more like the residue of a note that never got to Fa, Nish." And when asked if it was man-made, she paused. "It didn't start because I was there. I think I just stepped into where it still was." Today, the clearing holds nothing but grass and cedar shadow. But if you step slowly, some say, if you move gently across the slope, the ground hums, not because it's hollow, but because it remembers. And somewhere beneath it, folded, fused, and stilled, the choir of bones waits to be heard again. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday. No return address, no postage mark, just a pale cream envelope folded at a diagonal, creased as if closed not by hand but by pressure from something heavy. Inside, one page, slanted handwriting, no name, no date. The ink had smudged slightly in one corner, as though the author's hand had trembled or pressed too long. It began without greeting, without title. I was part of the first group. We sat straight, or tried. They said stillness would fix what moved in us. The page bore no closing signature. It ended mid-thought. Folded, not along the center, but into thirds, then angled again. A tucked corner where the crease veered, refusing symmetry. The Missouri Historical Society filed it under anomalous correspondence. It would not remain alone for long. By spring of 1903, 6 more letters arrived, each spaced exactly 11 days apart. Each came in the same heavy envelope, folded the same wrong way. The script was consistent, lean, slanted backward, the lines slipping upward across the page, as if attempting to climb out of the paper itself. Curators described the letters as tense to the eye, something not quite cursive, but also not print, somewhere in between, resisting the lines beneath it. Letter 2. We were told the spine must be still to let the hymn through, but mine cracked when I was 7. Not broke, just bent from the inside. The oil made it worse. It told me how to stand, but not how to stop hearing them. That phrase, not how to stop hearing them, appeared again in letter 3, scribbled faintly in the margin. A different hand, or the same, loosening. No one could say. By letter 4, the confession had turned darker, still unsigned. Faith is not straight, it folds. The sermons folded us. The pews were above us. We prayed upward, not to God, but to wait. We were not taught belief, we were taught position. Folded beneath this was a drawing, not a sketch, but a diagram. 3 stick figures, children most likely, strapped to upright frames. Above them a line labeled roof pulpit, and from that descending not words or light, but a thin pipe marked breath, not air. Beneath it, we learned to listen through our bones. The Missouri Historical Society archivist assigned to the case, Thomas Ellery, filed a report noting that the handwriting style matched no known person in their local genealogical registry, but that the angled folds resembled a binding technique used in 1840s private devotional pamphlets, particularly in temperance circles of the Riverbend Mission District. Ellery did not immediately connect the letters to the Delaney family, but one photograph, pinned years earlier to an unrelated case file, changed that. It showed a ledger page from Flint Hollow School, 1847, long believed destroyed, where the attendance roll included 2 names scratched out and replaced by small, crude, spine-like drawings. The notations beneath them read, "Folded for purpose, not yet realigned." The phrase "folded for purpose" appeared, verbatim, in letter 5. That letter also included the first hint of physical consequence. I can no longer sit on wood. The grain pushes through, I feel every tooth in it. I've tried chairs with cushions, still I feel the angle. The rooms tilt unless I lean back. I lean, but never enough. No one on staff could decipher whether the writer was describing a spinal deformity or a psychological condition. One medical historian, reviewing the letters, hypothesized it might be a form of historic postural trauma, a phrase she coined and later retracted. The term never entered formal use. Letter 6 came in mid-July, this time with a smear of what appeared to be wax across one corner. Though it was later determined not to be wax at all, it was linseed oil. Traces of it were tested. The chemical breakdown revealed high saturation, consistent with oil stored long past its expiration. At the center of the page, I no longer blink in rhythm with others. Mine is slower. Folded things move slower. There are still hymns that hold my jaw shut. I hum in my sleep, but the sound does not leave my throat. One curator, after reading it aloud to staff, reportedly left the room without explanation and returned an hour later with blood vessels burst across one eye. He claimed he leaned too close to the page while reading. Letter 7 arrived on August 11, 1903. Empty, no page inside, no ink, just the envelope, still folded, still sealed. Upon closer examination, archivist Ellery noted a faint indent on the inside of the flap, almost as if a word had been pressed but not written. With angled light, one phrase emerged: "The Folds remember." No further letters came. The envelope remains in Box 118, Archive X, Unclassified Holdings. In 1979, during a re-cataloging initiative, a young intern named Marcy Keller was tasked with digitizing the anomalous correspondence files. She rescanned all 7 envelopes and pages, inputting them one by one into a microfilm reader. But by the time she reached letter 4, the machine jammed. When it was pried open, one side of the film had curled. Not melted, folded, like it had been creased in a way the scanner couldn't handle. Keller noted in her report, "It bent not along the feed line but diagonally, as though resisting straight entry." In an audio log from 1981, a researcher revisiting the Delaney files referred to the letters as echoes with angles, words bent at the joints. He concluded the tape by quoting from memory what he believed to be the final line from letter 6. "Some hymns are not spoken aloud, they fold in the chest and wait. Mine is still folding." No further letters tied to the Delaney Folds have ever surfaced, no handwriting match has been made, and the Missouri Historical Society, though it retains physical custody of the envelopes, has refrained from placing them on public display, not out of fear, out of lack of consensus on what exactly they are. Are they memories, confessions, postural echoes bent onto paper, or something else, not meant to be read front-facing, something that only made sense when folded? It begins, as so many American records do, with a missing name. The Riverbend Public Birth Ledger, dated August 1838, contains a single entry for a newborn male, Delaney Folds. No parents listed, no midwife signature, just the infant's surname, inked with certainty as if to declare a legacy without explaining how it began. The margins are clean, no stains, no scrolled edits, no unusual marks. But the ink on that one line is slightly darker than the others, thicker, like the pen had paused there just long enough to wonder. Today, if one searches Delaney in the Missouri Genealogical Index, only that record returns. No census follows, no burial entry, no marriage, no land claim, no obituary. Just a birth with no origin, recorded in a town that barely existed. A child entered into the system, then disappeared into history, or perhaps was absorbed into it. In modern spinal clinics across Missouri, especially those serving rural counties along the Merrimack and Gasconade rivers, a particular skeletal irregularity has quietly appeared in pediatric evaluations. It's not listed in formal textbooks, nor flagged by national orthopedic bodies, but among certain seasoned doctors, those who've practiced long enough to notice patterns that don't speak aloud, the condition has a whispered name: the Flint Hollow curve. It's a spinal deviation, technically mild, structurally rare. The upper vertebrae arch forward too early, while the lower vertebrae twist ever so slightly to the left, forming a posture that physicians describe as held too still, too soon. Children with this curve often sit ramrod straight without prompting. They resist reclining. Some claim chairs press wrong, or complain that beds fold backward. No family history, no congenital markers, no traceable cause, just a shape in the spine, repeated in children whose families had never heard of Flint Hollow. 1D, Dr. Miriam Helbestam, pediatric specialist at St. Luke's Orthopedic Center, has catalogued 12 cases in the last 8 years. She agreed to speak off record during an interview for this investigation. It's not just the shape, it's the stillness. They're too composed, You ask them to bend and they do, but they look at you like you're asking them to sin. She showed us an anonymous intake form. At the bottom, under patient observations, verbatim, the note read, said, "My spine is a path and it must stay straight," repeated 3 times, monotone. The attending nurse circled the quote and added, faintly in pencil, "Voice didn't sound like his." This phrase, "My spine is a path," has appeared in 4 counties, in children between the ages of 6 and 10. Never in siblings, never twice in the same town. Each time the words are spoken unprompted, not in panic, not in fear, but with quiet conviction, as if reciting a lesson long rehearsed. When questioned, most children claim they don't remember saying it. In 1996, a retired court transcriptionist named Eleanor Reeves, sorting through a storage cabinet in her home outside Farmington, found a page she couldn't place. It was a carbon copy, old, faded, thin like onion skin, filed under a folder labeled Flint, Delaney, Misc. The page contained only 2 lines. "Child, I can feel the sermon in my posture." Court reporter, undocumented proceeding, no case ID found. Eleanor doesn't remember typing it. The Missouri State Archive confirmed no such proceeding exists in their judicial logbooks. The page was placed in a preservation sleeve. It now sits in the unclassified drawer at the Riverbend County Courthouse, never cited, never discarded. In 2008, an anonymous email was sent to the Department of Historical Medicine at the University of Missouri. It read, "There are sermons that moved inside children. They don't lay those Wayland. Eve, they align. The children are gone, but the sermon stayed. It folds into posture. That's what's wrong with the spines. You're treating a belief, not a bone. No signature, no traceable server." The faculty dismissed it as a hoax. But one faculty member, Dr. Alan Minvers, who had reviewed 3 Flint Hollow curve cases, forwarded the email to himself with the subject line, "Folded Faith." He passed away the following year. His notes on the email remain unpublished. Attempts to study the phenomenon formally have been hampered by its intermittent nature. Patients move, families relocate, cases vanish. When pressed, many physicians simply reclassify it as idiopathic scoliosis, a comfortable term for what we don't understand. But in some clinics, when a new case presents itself, staff still share a glance. A look that says, "Another one." During this investigation, we requested access to the basement archives of the Riverbend Mission Registry, which had cataloged regional church activity from 1835 to 1880. Most documents were sermons, census lists, and ledger inventories, but behind a warped shelf, we found a partial hymnal sheet, torn, oil-stained, and marked in pencil. Hymn of Posture, revised. Line 4, "Let the path hold firm inside thy back." Line 5, "Do not turn. The fold is straight." A faint smudge of linseed spread across the margin, clouding the rest. We brought this sheet to Dr. Halberstam. She looked at it for a long time. Finally, she said, "That's the language. That's what they're echoing. They don't know it, but they're echoing it." The Delaney name, the oil rituals, the inverted chapel, all remain fragments. No formal investigation was ever launched into the Delaney family. The Union Temperance Archives were dissolved in 1904. The barn site is now privately owned farmland, but the phrase remains. It surfaces every few years, out of a child's mouth, in a doctor's notes, on a spine that bends not from genetics, but from something more ancient, more deliberate, something left behind. A script etched not in ink, budant, T in alignment. So we return to the original ledger. August 1838. One name, no parents, no witnesses. Just this, Delaney. Male child, shoulders broad, head held unnaturally still. Beneath it, a faint pencil note, added decades later perhaps by a clerk or researcher. It reads, No entry before this, but the spine matches, if the path must stay straight. Then what happens when the truth bends? Like the video and subscribe for more stories history tried to bury. And if you're still watching, tell me where you're from and what time it is. There's comfort in knowing we're not alone in the dark.